down here at the Lake of the Ozarks, kind of near Tonka State Park, if you know where that is. It's real early in the morning. It's beautiful. So far, I'm the only one I see out here. This is nice. Very rare for the Lake of the Ozarks in the summer. As we've gone through the book of Matthew 24, which seems to be the direction we're going, if you haven't seen any of these videos up until this point, it was months ago, God kind of started calling me out on the water. I don't know what that meant. Just said, go out on the water and film. So finally I decided to be obedient to that. And as I prayed more about it, it seemed like he was saying for 40 days, go out on the water and preach. And that's what I'm doing. And it seems like we're going through the book of Matthew or Matthew 24. And I'm glad we are, because, there's a point where, if you've ever watched this channel, I'm not proud of where the Christian church has become. I don't think Jesus is either. I think the spirit within kind of makes me look at it and think this is not what Jesus wanted out of the church. And he knew that there would be churches like that. I just kind of want to speak to the wickedness of churches today a little bit, just because that's what Jesus is talking about right here in this moment. So we're just going to pick it up where we left off, Matthew 24, starting verse 45. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly, I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware of, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portions with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I think that much of the church is the wicked servant right now. I'm just going to kind of speak to, personally, I've always enjoyed church. I never had any personal problems at church. Like, nobody ever stirred up trouble for me. My problem with church is watching the wickedness and the hypocrisy and having a righteous anger from things that make God angry, make me angry. But as a high school teacher of 20 years, and I don't know what it was, but my students were always very open with me. They talked to me all the time. I had a very laid-back class, very laid-back atmosphere. There's a lot of trust. I can't really even begin to tell you how many stories I've heard of abuse of children, physical and sexual, mostly sexual, from the church. These students have shared with me time and time again the abuse, the mostly sexual, again, of the church. I know of at least 2 young ladies who almost committed suicide because of the church. It's really appalling. It's essentially this idea that I think they think, well, because I'm in charge, I can do whatever I want. And God is delaying. He does not know. So therefore, when Jesus comes and he sees his servants doing this, he says he's going to cut them in 2. That's pretty significant, that Jesus would cut somebody in 2. But he said he'd do it. And I believe him, because when he comes back, it's time for judgment. And the church is to be the bride of Christ. The bride. The church should be purifying herself, should be adorning herself in white. And the bride of Christ, clearly, Matthew 24 is going to lead into Matthew 25, which is the separation of the sheep and the goats. What should the church be doing? Feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, taking care of the widows and the orphans, and visiting the prisoners and the sick. That's what they should be doing. But they're definitely not doing that. Most of them are not doing that. Rarely ever will you come across a church that is actually doing that. And oftentimes, like around here, the Midwest, anytime you see a church feeding people, it's important to ask them where they got their food from. It probably came from a company called Harvesters. And oftentimes, there's a little cave up there, I'm going to go check that out. Oftentimes at Harvesters, oftentimes, I'm sorry, in the Midwest, I got distracted by the cave. Oftentimes in the Midwest, Harvesters will give organizations food to then feed the hungry, but those organizations will often bill them for rent, that kind of thing. So for example, one of the big mega churches in the town I grew up in, they have a food pantry, but Harvesters pays for the food, and Harvesters also pays them rent for that facility. But then they do their share of bragging about the food feeding they're doing. But I sorry, I don't mean to get off on a tangent. I think that cave distracted me. But the church should be feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, taking care of the widows, orphans. And if it's taking the money and it's keeping it for themselves, and which it is for the most part, when the money stays within those four walls and it all goes to things like guitars and lights and smoke machines and salaries, that's consuming the sacrifice of the altar. God actually turned a guy inside out in the Old Testament for that. It's consuming the sacrifice of the altar. It's definitely taking all those resources that should be feeding hungry people and buying guitars and smoke machines. That's part of that wickedness, but also the cruelty of it all. The sheer cruelty of it all is just ridiculous. Pause here for a second. So I'm going to check this cave out here in a little bit, but the message today is definitely that the wickedness of the church is abounding, and it's almost as if their hands have been untied, like they feel justified in this wickedness, like this wickedness is somehow justified. Like they're entitled to this wickedness in a weird way. It's very strange, very, very strange. But what I've seen in Christian leaders went from having a sympathetic heart to an entitled heart, really in the last 5 to 10 years. And that's what this wicked servant that Jesus is talking about is. He's very entitled, saying essentially the servant's gone, this stuff's mine now, like I'm in charge of this stuff now. So he beats the other servants and consumes all the food. Sound familiar to you? Sounds familiar to me too. I think I've heard that story multiple times all around this country, so and the world at that. Every time I put out a video like this, it's my church in Kentucky, my church in Alaska, my church in Mexico, my church in Indonesia. All around the world, they're having this exact same experience. It's the wickedness of the spirit of Satan, evil, that's why it's consistent throughout the world. So any thoughts on any of that? Don't be that wicked servant. Jesus cut you in two. Put it below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. Feel called to support this channel to Patreon. That link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests, so please don't ever hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.